This presentation will hopefully be short and sweet, just a run through of where we're at the moment. We're in January and looking towards, I suppose, a successful growing season ahead. If we can just focus, I suppose, on what needs to be done at this point in the year over the next kind of 4 to 6 weeks, will really give us a good head start on ensuring that we are successful with growing this year. So the 7 steps make up the Green Schools programme overall. So whether you're a year 1 school or a year 2 school, there's certain steps, I suppose, that should be taken before we enter the growing season. So all schools should have the committee up and running, ideally since the autumn. For year 1 schools, at this point in the year, ideally you'd also have your environmental review completed before you take action. So that is looking at the awareness survey, which is in the handbook, and a downloadable PDF online as well, and mapping out your food environment, your food and biodiversity environment inside the school and outside on the school grounds. So that environmental review should ideally be done, and if it hasn't been done, if you're still in year 1 and you're just not finished it yet, try and get that done as soon as possible before you start taking action. Really, the main reason is that the environmental review will help you design the best actions for your school, because it's just giving you a very solid picture of where you're starting from and looking at your site in terms of growing. So complete those 2 steps, those 2 parts of the environmental review if you haven't already. And now we're really moving on to the action plan at this end of the year, looking at drawing up the actions to take between now and the summer months. And it is pretty busy. Obviously, the seasons won't wait for anybody. You can't really cram when it comes to the seasons. So it's just important, I suppose, hence we're having the session this evening. For year 2 schools, you would have all of those steps ideally taken last year. So you should have your committee up and running again this year, having had one running last year. Your environmental review ideally would have been done by this time last year, and your action plan should ideally have been in place for nearly a year at this stage. And this is your second year of growing. Year 2 schools, you probably have some of your curriculum work identified and listed from the work you've done over the year. You probably have a bit of informing and involving done already from last year's work, and your green code is likely to be in place. In terms of your monitoring and evaluation, that's just a repeat of the environmental review, and that must be completed just before you submit your application for your green flag in March of this year. So you may have this partly started, but I expect most schools will look at the monitoring and evaluation, i.e. repeating the environmental review, the 2 surveys there, kind of between now and March. So with the action plan, I suppose the format of the 2 years of work on this theme, we suggest in year 1, you have your gentle introduction to the theme, where you're beginning your environmental review and all of that. And then the spring moves to growing crops and harvesting them and making nice meals out of them wherever possible. In year 2, it's a very similar structure to the year, except in year 2, schools should do a research project on one of the global topics. The global topics are 8 topics that we've outlined and provided a good bit of guidance, I suppose, on via the global topics cards, which we've circulated by email, and they're also available to download by PDF. So ideally at this stage, year 2 schools will have gotten in to studying at least one of them at this stage. And so we're all now moving towards the spring and summer, where we're growing crops and harvesting them with celebrations. So getting ready for growing, I suggested that there's 4 kind of key things to look at the moment to get you into the groove, I suppose, of what needs to be done for the months ahead. So they are identifying growing sites and allocating the areas to different crops, then deciding what to grow. Those are kind of interdependent on each other to some degree. Then actions to take before the seeds go into the ground. So it's looking at preparing sites and ensuring you have the right materials. And then looking at overall timelines for all of those things. So looking at the first things first, I suppose, identifying the growing sites and allocating the areas. All of our work is going to be based around the crop cards, really. So we have approximately 11 plus a few species of crops that we suggest you grow, and they're all relatively fast growing, and they are all just should be ready by May or June. And so looking at the sites of where they can be started and where they're going to go, the environmental review, as I said, will give you a lot of information around that. So if you have looked inside and outside at your food growing environment, you should probably have, I suppose, spotted some, your raised beds, your potential, if you've planter pots, if you've hanging baskets, or even spaces for those. And inside then, looking at windows, south-facing windows, windows that are going to get nice sunlight throughout the day, and areas basically generally that are good for starting off crops. So just I suppose, a couple of key things to remember when you're identifying your indoor sites for getting the small seeds growing. You want plenty of sunlight, but not too much direct sunlight. So most windowsills are fine for that, but I suppose on very sunny days, especially if the room is very warm, you might just be mindful that not to leave everything sitting in direct sunlight for too long, because it'll just dry out and overheat. And also, it's really crucial not to put your seeds that you're starting off directly over radiators, because that will dry out the soil really quickly. Typically, when we're starting off seeds, they're in very shallow trays, like the top picture there, so they're prone to drying out very quickly. So just there, I suppose, the general guidelines for areas for starting your seeds inside, you want them to be in bright areas, but not where they're going to overheat. Outdoors then, some of the crops, we'll look at them in a minute, but some of the crops will be planted straight outside. Others do need to be started indoors and then moved outside. So identifying where the crops will be outside, every school is totally different. So if you feel that your school is a bit of a concrete jungle, don't worry about that. We have had schools in all shapes and sizes taking part successfully on this program before, and pots and sacks and tubs all lined up against the wall or on window baskets, hanging baskets, they all can fit the bill, and you'll definitely get success growing something or lots of things, even if you don't have a big green area. If you have more green space and you have like the likes of raised beds and flower beds, you can work away with them. You may have been doing this already as part of your normal school life. You can introduce no-dig beds. They're kind of a simple version of getting I suppose, some kind of a flower bed ready for vegetables. We have a guide online for which I'll share the link for that later on. So a no-dig bed is basically where you just cover the ground with, say, cardboard, and then cover that with your compost and soil, so you're not actually digging into the earth. And it's a great option if you have the space. The important things, again, the environmental factors to consider when you're picking the areas outside are to consider light levels and rain shadows. So the light level, you're looking at, obviously if you're trying to put a vegetable bed under a hedge, it's not going to be ideal. You need a good bit of light, direct sunlight hitting the beds to get the temperatures up and for optimal growing conditions. It's okay to be a little bit shaded, but just, you wouldn't have, as I say, a vegetable bed under a hedge. Out a little bit from it would be ideal. And as much south-facing planting areas as possible would be great. The rain shadow is, where your prevailing wind is coming from. So say if you are planting in tubs or areas close to buildings or fences, what you can have is, if the prevailing wind is coming, say, from the west, and your planting areas are on the east of a tall wall or building, if the wind is blowing the rain, it'll not land right next to the wall or the building. It's essentially there's shelter there. It's the area that you'd stand if you were trying to stand in out of the rain. So just be mindful that if you do have tubs and pots kind of tucked in against a wall or close to a wall or of a building or a fence, that those areas might not be getting as much rain everywhere else. So you might just need to top up with watering cans and that. So just to be, I suppose, keeping an eye out for where you're putting or you're planning to put your plants in, and just understanding, I suppose, the environmental conditions there. So the crops that we suggest are downloadable in a PDF called the crop cards on the Food and Biodiversity webpage. The link is on the top of that slideshow, and I should say that, or on the top of that slide, and I can circulate this presentation to everybody who's here today by PDF, so you'll have that link. But the crop cards basically are each page is it gives it an outline of how best to grow each of these crops. So as I said, there's kind of like 11 crops that if you put all the lettuces and salad leaves in as one, because they all grow in pretty much the same way. In the crop cards booklet, it gives you a detailed description of how to go about planting, sowing and tending to each of these crops. It tells you the best times to do that. And it gives you all the guidance you need really around each one. So it also tells you, we have a little indicator on each page how the level of difficulty. So some are simple, easy, and some are more difficult to grow. So it's kind of an indication on each page as to which one. So it's kind of up to you, I suppose, as the coordinator, to decide how you're going to distribute or I suppose guide the school and your colleagues to grow these. I mean, you know, you could potentially just decide yourself that you're going to give each class, say, 2 crops to grow and give them a hard one and an easy one each. Or you may give each class 1 crop to grow, or you may decide, that you just don't have the big outdoor growing spaces for maybe potatoes or onions, so you might just give them to one class, and then all the other classes would grow something that's small and easy like the lettuces. So it's entirely up to you how to grow, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through today. But I suppose once you've decided what you can grow in terms of your space and capacity on the grounds, then it'd be great to try and get as much of a diversity of crops growing then. Things that will affect, I suppose, or inform the crops that you might want to grow are the seasons, especially. I didn't ask actually if there's anybody here that's in secondary school. You may have noticed that the calendar isn't really in your favor. Just popping back there, there's certain things like potatoes and carrots and the dwarf French beans that no matter how early you plant them, really they won't be ready for harvesting until the school is closed. So you have to be obviously mindful of the calendar and the seasons. The planting time around Easter can be a little bit challenging, so there is a note on each of the crop cards kind of suggesting when best to plant, whether it's before the Easter break, if the Easter break's early or late. So that's one tricky thing. Obviously, the earlier you plant, the sooner they'll ripen, but the earlier you plant, if it's before the Easter break, then you have to deal with how the plant's going to be tended to during that break. So for a lot of the plants, it might just be better off to not plant them until straight after you come back after Easter. So that changes kind of year on year, obviously, as the Easter break falls. So you just have to make your best judgment on that. For deciding what plants to grow as well, we have the harvest recipe booklet. So that's basically a cookbook, a compilation of recipes that link directly in with the crops that we are growing or that we've suggested that schools grow. So it might be kind of a reverse way of deciding what you want to grow. So if you identify a recipe that you really like, or one of your colleagues identifies a recipe that they really like, that they might then go to choose that particular crop to ensure that meal can be made. So that's another way to look at it, I suppose. Considering the space available as well, some crops are going to take up more space than others. For example, potatoes would take up more space than strawberries and so on. So, and different types of space as well. So just figuring out what space you have available for those crops is important too. Another thing to consider is the enthusiasm or the experience levels of different staff. Like, we would promote as much as possible that all classes would grow something. Now, I know that's not always practicable, but wherever possible, like, it really is an amazing, I'll put up some testimonials at the end on one of the slides. But like, it's amazing the positive feedback we've had from this body of work from schools that have completed this theme already. And, teachers and classes that didn't expect to get much from it have really excelled and got way more than they ever bargained for from it. So I suppose trying to pull everybody in, even at whatever level they're at, is really worthwhile. So if a staff member has really no experience and not showing too much enthusiasm, you could just give them the lettuces, or some of the easier ones that are a bit more foolproof. The other thing to consider is the age group as well. So if you have, say, a junior infant class, they mightn't have the dexterity to plant lettuce seeds because they're kind of fiddly and small, whereas they would be better off planting the big peas or the beans. So things like that, making sure that you're supporting colleagues just to pick the things that'll be the easiest for them, especially if there's not great buy-in per se. The diversity of crops is something else to consider, like the more variety, I suppose, across the school that you can manage to get, the more knowledge you've learned. Like some crops are a bit harder to grow than others. So if you do have a couple of I suppose green-fingered staff that are happy to take a risk and try some of the harder crops. None of them are very hard, but just, if they're happy to take on some of the harder crops, that's a learning for the whole school then, an appreciation being built up. So where possible, try to maximize the diversity of crops across the school. As I suggested already, perhaps having multiple crops per class, this can help, especially if there's a failure. So if a tray of lettuce dries out, or something happens that it gets tipped over and falls out, you can still have the other crop to rely on. So having, maybe each class growing two separate types of crops might be something to consider. Another interesting way to go is picking heirloom varieties. So these are kind of traditional older varieties that you wouldn't see in any supermarket shelf. So you've seen the pictures of multicolored corn or red or purple carrots and potatoes that are blue or purple. So there's lots of these other varieties of crops that you wouldn't get on your shelf. Some of those would be available on Seed Savers. That's one of the Irish organic seeds shops. There are other organic organic seed providers, but a lot of them be from Europe, like on the continent. But so that's the Irish one. I don't know what level of variety they have in their heirloom stock at the moment, but anyway, just something to consider if you have a particular interest in that kind of area. And finally, just to say, don't forget the herbs. So an awful lot of schools already have herbs growing either in sensory gardens or in pollinator beds, and they're really great. So just to bring class awareness to those, and they can obviously be incorporated into lots of different recipes, and they of course count as part of the work on this theme, and should most definitely be used as part of your recipes that you're working on. So maybe mapping them out and finding what you already have and maybe adding to them for the school overall, it would be worthwhile too. So then actions to take before the seeds go into the ground. I suppose a lot of it is just kind of getting a bit organized and deciding who's going to grow what and what's going to grow where. So yeah, deciding what to grow and figuring out how you're going to manage that across the school, and then getting your seeds. So that's actually quite important to try and get focused on sooner rather than later. So my partner he's a vegetable grower. And it's part-time of his work. So he's actually, after getting all of his seeds ordered in the last, say, fortnight. So now is really the time where you're beginning to get the ball rolling. So if you can get your seeds ordered in the next kind of fortnight, that would be great. You can order organic seeds online. Seed Savers is there, and there's brown envelope seeds as well. They're preferable. They probably are a little bit more expensive. Or you can just go to your regular garden centre, and they will have probably a limited range of organic, and then they'll have loads of other ones, and there's no harm having the other ones, but obviously organic in terms of biodiversity would be preferred. Seeds are generally very cheap, so as in you get for €3 or €4 you get tens or hundreds of seeds, so they do go a long way. So you won't, I think the biggest problem is actually trying to stop yourself from buying more, especially if you get to a garden centre and there's such variety there in front of you. Trying to draw a line under it and say, okay, that's enough now is probably more of the challenge. As I say, they are relatively inexpensive. So then checking and getting tools and equipment, really there's not a huge amount that you need for getting going. Simple cartons, simple containers will do, and obviously over time as a school gets into it, you can add to your equipment. Starting off for a lot of the seeds and a lot of the crops, starting them off in the classroom, say, having toilet roll tubes or egg cartons are very handy, because really then you don't need to take the soil out as such. You just have to slit open the egg carton, or say the toilet roll tube, just make holes in it and put the whole thing in the ground, because it's totally biodegradable. So start collecting toilet roll tubes and egg cartons. If you wish, if you don't have I suppose industrial planting trays or that, those kind of plastic planting trays. The one tool I'd say is really helpful and handy is the trowel. You know, light sandcastle bucket trowels aren't going to work, or little shovels aren't going to work. Like, the trowel is sturdy and strong and does a good bit of work. You don't need them, but they are very helpful. So even if you were able to get your hands on kind of 5 this year and then get 5 next year, and and build it up over a few years, and just keep them in a big sturdy bucket, I'd say that's the only tool that you'd really need when you're working with a class group. A watering can is very handy, but as you can see in the image there, we ourselves here, we just when we're inside, especially using the for watering the trays inside, a 2 litre bottle of water a 2 litre bottle from a milk jar basically is ideal. And you just pierce a couple of holes in the cap, clean it out very well, make sure there's no milk left in it, and have a couple of holes in the cap. And they're great, and obviously they're free, they're really easy to come by. And if you have 5 or 10 of them in a bucket somewhere where the kids can all take part and help with the watering quite easily, it's a really handy way to do it. If you do want to get lots of pots, say for starting off, proper pots, or you think that you're going to need a lot of pots because you don't have the growing space, I would recommend getting in touch with a local landscaping company, like somebody like SAP, anybody that does kind of industrial landscaping, because they would come in, they'd do loads, they'd put loads of bedding plants in, and they'd have a stack of pots left over that they don't have much use for. Or your local authority parks department would be the same. And I've sourced like tens of pots, like hundreds of pots actually, through local landscaping company actually over the last few years myself. So I know they're happy to do it, especially if they know it's for a school, they're happy to donate them and drop them off for you often. So that's if you do want lots of pots, and if you do feel you'll need them and get use out of them. Then making or getting labels is also pretty important. As you're putting your crops into the ground or into seed trays or on your windowsill, it is important to put the date on it and the crop types. When it's due to germinate, and then you'll know if it hasn't germinated, if more than 3 weeks or whatever has passed and there's still no sign of anything, that the seeds have failed. So it's important to have labels on what's going in. And obviously in the school setting with students involved, whether you're doing a tray per table or whatever, it's being able to label the trays according to the students that have taken part, so they know which one's theirs, is quite important. The bottom, I don't know if you can see it very well, the bottom left hand picture there are some lovely labels that a community garden that I visited once created. So they got big stones and they painted them in a base color of red, and then they wrote on the different crops in white. So those stones then could be moved every year to whichever bed they were relevant for. So Jerusalem artichoke, I can see carrot and other stuff there. So another way to maybe incorporate that into an art class or that, picking up curriculum links there. So then in terms of preparing the growing spaces themselves, at this time of year, you would want to be considering getting out there and getting the weeds away, having the beds clear and ready to go. So that over the next, I suppose, few weeks, you could wait until the colder weather has cleared and the frost and all that. So, but that's just, I suppose, to be mindful of, that once the crops are starting in the class, they will need somewhere to go quite quickly. So having, I suppose, that basic level of work done and the beds ready more or less from a few weeks out, it would be ideal. Getting raised beds installed, I think if it's probably not too late. I know GIY have an initiative at the moment that will be rolling again next year, so more relevant maybe for year 1 schools or year 2 schools if you've gotten really involved in it and want to progress your own school grounds. GIY in Waterford, they have a schools program now where they're actually sending out school kits worth a couple of grand to schools to help them set up and get going. So it might be worth looking on their website. I'm not sure what stage, as I say, the call for that is. I know they've awarded a lot of schools already this year, so it might just be for next season, but worth looking into. Making a no-dig bed, the link is there actually. That's a live link there where I have that written to a PDF and information on our own website about how to create that kind of flower bed, and label the beds by class or by teacher name, even before the plants have gone in, so everyone's clear and know. It has happened in schools before where one class has gone out and planted seeds, and then in those first few days after those seeds go in, it still looks like an empty bed, and if there's no label there to say we have planted this on this date, somebody else might come out and then try and plant their seeds in the same bed, and then no, it's anyone's guess what's going to come up first or at all. So just labeling is important, inside and outside. Just overall timelines: start as early as possible and practicable. So just the Easter break is the big issue, I suppose, in terms of timing. So just check what the crop cards are suggesting you do, check the dates with Easter, and make a call. If you feel you'd really like to have a good crop of something in particular that should probably go in after Easter, or sorry, should go in before Easter to have it ready for harvesting as early as possible in May, well then maybe looking at options for how and who might take care of the seedlings. So could a teacher, could a student, would the caretaker be able just to keep an eye on them and water them over the Easter break? So for some crops they will have to be planted before Easter, but most can probably wait, and each crop card, as I say, will inform that and let you know what can be done when. So these are just some pictures from last year's schools. I'll give you a couple of minutes just to read these testimonials from 3 schools that took part last year. So I'll just be silent for a couple of minutes whilst you read that. Okay, sorry, I hope everyone's finished. As I say, I'll distribute the PDF of this afterwards. And I suppose finally, really, what we're building up towards by planting all of these crops is to complete this circle, and to really, I suppose, have the students experience with all of their senses the services that biodiversity provides to us. So i.e. they're going to eat the food with great pleasure, hopefully, in May and June, and have that full experience and really, I suppose, in-depth learning on how the natural world provides us with so much. Food is central to that. There's lots of other ecosystem services, obviously, that biodiversity is providing to us. But really, I think the pinnacle really of this program is the tasting of the food afterwards. And there's research out there showing that kids will actually taste novel foods, so taste food that they've never tasted before, or they'll try foods they've never had before more readily if they've grown it themselves. So this is a great way to introduce kids to eating fresh food and broadening their palate as well. So the Harvest Recipe Booklet is the third kind of critical PDF that we provide to schools, and that is downloadable on we have the link at the end of the slideshow again. and lots of different recipes there. Some are no cook, some rely on a hob if you have a hob in the school, and some are oven cook. And so depending on what options and facilities you have available to you in the staff room or in the school grounds overall. So just to point out again as well that we have different workshops online that can be used by primary and secondary school teachers. It doesn't have to be, the Green Schools Committee or the coordinator. Like, these can be distributed to all teachers, all colleagues and staff in the school to see if they would like to run them with any class groups. So things looking at like food labels and where the food has come from, just being a bit more critical with thinking more critically about the food system. Looking at, there's a soil workshop as well, there's a seeds workshop as well, looking at where seeds come from, how they grow, and just that whole concept of the life cycle of a plant. The crop cards, the harvest recipes are, I suppose, the core elements of the core resources really for this theme overall. And then we also have, to support that work as well, we have lovely cooking skills demonstrations and workshops online on YouTube. So there's a live link there to that as well. And for Year 2 schools, then there's the global topics from that, you'd work on normally in the autumn of your second year. So that's everything. There's loads of live links there as well to the Food and Biodiversity Handbook, the awareness survey, presentation lessons, application forms for those schools applying for the Green Flag in the coming weeks, and the Food and Biodiversity Theme page, primary school case study, and the YouTube playlist are all there as well. So I will send, for all of you who have emails to take part in the session this evening, I can send the PDF directly back to that email address, and my direct email address there is on the screen in front of you. So that's everything.